Here to go through the papers with me, Noah Khogali, political commentator with Young Voices UK and Conservative councillor. Noah, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie. How are you?
The Conservatives are in for some pretty stinging criticism from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, a little bit later this afternoon. If we look at that story, she says the Conservatives have left in public spending a £20 billion hole. What do you make of her analysis and some of the strategies she's going to use to remedy it? So selling off empty public buildings, curbing the use of quite costly consultants.
Look, this was entirely predictable. She said during the election that she wouldn't be able to do this because, we've got the OBR now, but she's done what I think everybody else predicted that she would do and come in and feigned this, it's so much worse than we thought it was. Now we're going to have to raise taxes and you can blame the Conservatives. It was predictable that this was the stunt she was going to pull during the election.
And who was to blame then, do you think?
What's happening now. Pardon?
Who is to blame?
This is an issue that has been ongoing, but realistically, Labour, in preparation for government, didn't properly lay out how they were going to match, for example, the intended above-inflation pay rise that we're about to give out to teachers and doctors. They pretended that they could just do that and that they weren't going to have to raise taxes to do it. And this was a criticism that came from various non-political organisations, to be fair, about the Conservatives as well in the run-up to the election, that nobody was really tackling those economic challenges head on. And that's something that's now going to bear fruit. There is an interesting challenge here for Labour specifically, because that reduction in the size of the state tends to be a Conservative thing, and it's much easier for Conservatives to philosophically square up with that, because it's just easier to accept. But if you were on the left and you do believe in that bigger state, that more bloated, spend more money state, then this is much harder to square away philosophically. And it's going to be interesting to see how Labour backbenchers do that.
Well, I think it'll be easy to blame the Conservatives now. In a year, in 2 years' time, that might become more challenging. The challenge right now for the Conservative Party, and Kemi Badenoch's been writing in the Times this morning announcing her leadership, is who's going to lead the official opposition. Kemi Badenoch says she's going to turn the tide of liberalism. Are you supportive of her?
I'm kind of holding off, I think, for the time being. This is a long leadership election, and all of the leadership candidates are going to have a chance to give a proper pitch. I think people jumping too early to support a candidate over another means that we won't be able to have the philosophical debate that I think is the most important thing here. And Kemi Badenoch has mentioned, she did mention in that leadership pitch that she wanted to return to Conservative, to Tory values. But part of the problem that I think we've run into is nobody's entirely sure what those Tory values that everybody in the party agrees on are anymore. And that's how we've held this Conservative coalition together for so long, is that there were things like, for example, freedom and the small state that everybody agreed on. But those have kind of been lost now. And that's why reform has appeared. And that's something that all the leadership candidates need to grapple with. And it's encouraging that so many have talked about unity. But that's something that I think they are all going to have to, that's a discussion they're all going to have, and that needs to be thoughtful, it needs to be philosophical. That might be a little bit boring at times, it's not as exciting as mudslinging and finger pointing, but that's something that we need to do to secure the future of the party, and also to ensure that this is a party that returns to government and leads the country in the right direction.
That's certainly Kemi Badenoch's plan. How do you stave off reform?
Reform as a party, I think, has a tendency towards interventionism and a larger state. Obviously, there is not that many of their MPs, their individual personalities will come out a lot more, but that tends to be what you get with more populist-leaning parties. It's easy solutions, and those easy solutions are often the big state. The Conservatives need to remember that freedom and the smaller state and letting people be amazing and not having the state impose on everything in their lives is something that has driven the Conservatives in many variations of philosophical unity for a long time. That's the core of the Conservative Party, and that needs to be the dividing line with reform.
One thing that is in the government's intro today is dealing with this potential strike by GPs. I'm looking at the front page of the Eye here. It says GPs threaten to bring the NHS to a standstill by capping daily patient numbers. It's the first time there'd be industrial action for 60 years. And what might happen is GPs limit the number of patients they can see each day from kind of what is currently about 40 or 50 to 25. I mean, what do you think should happen here?
It would be an absolute catastrophe for Labour to have strikes this early on in their government. Part of what they kind of heralded as a big win immediately after winning the election was that the strikes were going to stop. They were going to bring, that adults were back in the room. But if strikes happen almost immediately after entering government, and that sheen that you've had since the election is going to disappear very, very, very quickly. And part of the issue here is a 1.9% funding increase for GP surgeries. If you are Rachel Reeves and you're going on a stage today to talk about how the government has so little money, turning around and bowing to strikes immediately is going to make you look disingenuous. And that's the real challenge here, is this new Labour government is now going to have to decide, do they want to be consistent with their line on the state's finances and risk strikes, or do they want to be spending money they say they don't have just to stave them off politically?
I mean, it seems as though there was an independent body that suggested the 5.5 pay rise for teachers and for NHS workers. The indications we've had from the Chancellor that she is going to honour that.
Yeah, and because of the rhetoric they used in the run-up to the election and over the past couple of years, they've backed themselves into a corner on that.
That's the right decision, though, isn't it? After, I think that junior doctors have been on strike for 11 times in the last year and a half. The Conservatives totally failed to deal with that.
It will absolutely be the consistent decision because that's the rhetoric that they've used. But it's hard to square that with Rachel Reeves' rhetoric that she's likely to use today about how there is this huge black hole and there's no money for things.
She also says there's a cost to not settling, which of course there is.
Absolutely. But the challenge for her as a government that's trying to hold together the Labour Party, you've already seen rebellions, is you're going to have MPs now turn around and go, well, if there's money for that, there's money for the two-child benefit cap or any number of other projects. That's
well, I think Keir Starmer was very clear on the child benefit cap. He said, look, we want to bring children out of poverty, but right now we can't afford to put in place that policy. And if you vote against me, you lose the right to vote for the Labour Party.
Absolutely. But he may have now put 7 martyrs into party that potentially will now have a louder voice if Labour starts spending on other things. That's the challenge here. And obviously this has been a long plan to get into government. But this is the challenge now that you've got lots and lots of Labour MPs who are all going to have things that they've campaigned on locally that they want to spend money on. And there is a real challenge for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer to, tell them to temper their expectations, but also be doing things that are incredibly justifiable, like agreeing with pay bodies. That's really difficult, and there's a really fine line, to have to walk along.
We've had a text in from Christopher. Good morning. He says, remember, the Conservatives were promising more tax cuts. Were they honest with the state of the economy? That might give you food for thought this morning, listening at home. Let's move away from politics briefly, Noah. And the Just Stop Oil guru who's in the paper this morning says the record jail sentences handing down to 5 Just Stop Oil activists could be a massive trigger event provoking further action. Could it be that those extremely lengthy sentences, 5 years for some of them, could be something that actually re-galvanises the movement for Just Stop Oil?
I'd be surprised if it's going to lead to anything. What I'd hope it leads to is less destructive action. So you'll have people actually, considering whether what they're doing is the best way of going around protesting, something that they obviously genuinely believe in and is an important issue, but is stopping people from going to cancer appointments and leaving disabled children without medication because they're stuck in traffic. Is that the sensible way of going about it? It's not. And I think these sentences hopefully will push people towards a more positive form of demonstration.
Yeah, and what would that look like?
There is any number of... they had protests in London a few years ago, which were very well attended. They were very poignant. They drew attention to the issue, and they didn't just...
Did they change anything? I guess that's the challenge.
They've not changed anything by disrupting by disrupting motorways. They've just ended up in prison. I think fundamentally, if you're going to lead to policy change, you need to engage in that policy discussion productively, and that's not something that they have really done up to this point. They've just pushed the general public further and further away from them. And that's not helpful for their cause. Look, climate change is a problem. We need to deal with it. But if you are annoying the public by talking about it, that's not productive, because then you lose that advocacy from the public. And there is an element of potentially ego there, where if you believe you are, the savior of the world, you are the savior of the country, it gives you a right to do anything. But that's not necessarily a productive way of enacting policy change, which is fundamentally what they really want. And this has not been a productive way of going about it.
Noah, thank you so much. Noah Khogali, political commentator and Conservative councillor, going through the papers with me this morning.